Jimmy. Jimmy, thank you for joining us today.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me, Charlie. You're right. I hadn't really thought about it. I was sitting the other side of the table for once. It's exciting.
We're excited to hear what you're saying. We're glad that you agreed to come on. So we're very excited to hear more about your podcast because it's so relevant for today's sort of future career opportunities and pathways. So it's really relevant. So thank you for agreeing to come on.
Pleasure. I can't wait to do it. It's a great way to kick off the year.
Good. So to start with, just so our young people can kind of get to know who you are and where you come from and why you're here, can you tell us a little bit about your journey through your career and what it is you do?
Yeah, I spent 15 years of my career between business and politics and trying to understand both sides of those. And that sort of culminated in what most people will know me for as advising the Prime Minister on business and entrepreneurship between 2016 and 2019. I always used to joke that they would be seen as the quiet years. Obviously, Downing Street got even more intense in the years after that. So I was primarily there through the kind of Brexit negotiations and so on. And my job was basically to be a go-between between the Prime Minister and chief executives in Britain, largely about what we were doing about Brexit negotiations, as it were, but there were lots of other things in there as well, such as jobs of the future and so on. So, the Prime Minister works about 90 hours a week. She could perhaps dedicate maybe one couple of hours of those to seeing businesses alongside all of her other engagements. And obviously you've got a whole host of business leaders that want to see her and get their views across. So I was that sort of go between the two places and taking messages back and forth. Prior to that, part of the reason I got the job was that I'd been at the Institute of Directors for a few years beforehand, running their Young Entrepreneurs Club, and it's like a business lobby organisation. So that's where I was prior to Downing Street, and then I left Number 10 in the autumn of 2019. We were starting a family, and Boris Johnson just came in, who I'd worked with when he was Mayor of London, actually, and I sort of said to him that it was time for me to go and do something else, go and have a new challenge, etc. I didn't know what that was going to be, but starting a family, etc., was the right time for me to do something else. And I went off to go and study in America for a while. Me and the family went out there, and it was incredibly exciting, and studying out in San Francisco. And then we got back, and it was March 2020, and my wife went back to work because she was a doctor. I became a stay-at-home dad to our 5-month-old. So I'd sort of gone from Downing Street to diapers in the space of a few months. It was quite a sort of lifestyle change for me. I'd used to be flying around the world on RF Voyager, my phone going hundreds of times a day, to nothing, just sitting at home with a 5-month-old, frankly, just glad if somebody gave me a call about PPI or insurance coming through. And it was during this time that my 5-month-old and I, there won't be any parents. There may be some people who've got brothers and sisters of that age, perhaps in the audience. And you can't do much with a 5-month-old, and we couldn't go and see anyone, and we couldn't do anything. We had a 1-hour walk around the park a day, and that was it. And so we listened to loads of podcasts, and I basically came up with this idea of, is there something that I could do to help tackle the unemployment crisis coming up? And that's where I thought, gosh, I used to speak to all these amazing business leaders in Number 10, like Ben Francis of Gymshark, for example. And one of the things I was always fascinated by was talking to him about where he was hiring and where he thought the jobs of tomorrow were going to be. And so that's where the idea for Jimmy's Jobs of the Future came from. Although I would say originally, and this is an interesting lesson for people, I think, that I was going to call it Careers Council. And I spoke to a few entrepreneurs about the idea, and they were like, this is a great idea, you'll be brilliant at it, but my gosh, the branding of that is terrible, nobody will ever remember that. And that's where somebody else actually came up with the name Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. So it's always worth going and speaking to people and testing your ideas.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned where the name came from, because that was definitely something I was thinking, like, where did that come from and how did that come about? So it's great that you've already ticked that off at the start. Really interesting story, really. I think it's crazy to see how many people's careers path changed so drastically during COVID. And it's just becoming a natural thing now, isn't it? But definitely from, working in politics to hosting podcasts is definitely a big career change for sure. So obviously you've gone through it as well. Everything, the world is changing, it's evolving, and it's evolving so quickly sometimes before we even know what's happening. You know, how do you stay informed about these emerging trends and job opportunities that you have to find and feature on your podcast?
Well, so I think it's a really good question, because I think it's one of the challenges for young people nowadays is that there is so much information out there, and it can be really difficult to know what to consume, when to consume it. And I think one of the ways that I try and think about it is that, you should try and think about your media diet in the same way that you think about your kind of food diet and so on. And it's fine to kind of eat things that aren't healthy for you from time to time, but you should try and think about what you're trying to sort of consume. And I think it's one of the big things now that young people should try and think about is kind of cultivating their feeds, and what are they kind of consuming, because there's lots of people out there now kind of creating quite good content. Jimmy's Jobs is one, but you've got Stephen Bartlett, Diary of a CEO, and even things like the Sidemen. Are creating interesting and entertaining content. And so that's what I would think about with those things. When something that I do now is that I still read the Times each morning. That's my kind of like media diet. I pay for a subscription and I just read it, and I know then that I'm not going to miss anything kind of major in the world if I go through the Times each day. And then when it comes to sort of the job side of things, I follow quite a few sort of venture capital blogs. It's worth saying, a couple of episodes have talked about this on Jimmy's Jobs, is like follow the money. And if you're following some of those things, you can kind of see what's exciting, what's happening in the world of business. That's where so many of the great ideas kind of come from, the west coast of America. But it is something I'm eternally fascinated about, is what do people read? And I would be quite interested, if people are going to ask questions, they could say what they find the most interesting content they read. Because I still ask people now every day on the podcast, what's the most interesting thing you've read lately, or what's the most interesting thing you've watched? We had Rishi Sunak on the podcast ago, and he gave a list. I mean, it was about as long as arm of all the different things that he reads. So that's always quite an they're useful sources.
Really interesting, and definitely love a little tidbit from your show there. You might get some people who want to go and find out more. Yeah, definitely. I think it's really important to kind of be really aware. It's so easy now as well, isn't it, to find out information? But sometimes it's the motivation to go and actually do that that can be the difficult thing, I think, particularly when you're young. There's lots to do and not enough time
Yeah.
to do it sometimes. So in your podcast, you discuss various jobs and various different industries that have come kind of more prominent and to the forefront of what we think will be the future. How do you select those jobs and go, that's what I want? And the really key, because there's so much out there that's changing and so many industries, so you keep on top of it. But how do you know, like, that's the job that I want to research and find out more about for this future?
So it often comes down to what I think would be most interesting and what would appeal to people. And for our 100th episode that we did last year, we went and interviewed Miles Jacobson, the chief executive of Football Manager, because I was thinking back to my sort of 16, 17-year-old self, sitting there thinking, who would I want to hear from? And they now employ 300 people at Football Manager. It's quite a big company, and they actually employ 1,500 scouts and researchers across the world. And I just thought, who are those 300 people? What do they do? I thought, sort of 15 years into my career, and I still don't really know. So we went and interviewed Miles for the podcast, and it was really interesting, because it was like, obviously we need developers and we need computer programmers, right? Everyone gets that with Football Manager. We're never short of those people applying. What we are actually short of at Football Manager is getting people that can create a narrative and have got English language skills, because that's part of the story arc that we kind of create within the game, and we want people to remain engaged with it. And we just don't get those people applying because they're not looking there. And that has stuck with me as a really interesting thing, is that, you know, every company needs finance and accountant people, right? Every company needs PR and marketing to a degree. And so I think that's the thing for people, is that if you want to work in football, say, you don't have to go and sort of work at Football Manager. There are different skills that you can learn that will be relevant for a career in that industry. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think it's quite interesting because I know that a lot of young people, what they're good at doesn't always bring them a lot of happiness. You can be really good at maths, but not like want to spend every minute of the day doing it. So it's really interesting to think about, sometimes if you're really good at something, maybe you can think about places that can be applied that aren't always obvious.
Yeah, and I would say as well, it can be really hard to know what you're good at, like particularly when you're young. But we talk about skills of the future and all of this. It can be very difficult to know what your skills are. It can be very difficult to do that self-analysis. I mean, you should go and ask people, and particularly teachers and parents and friends of parents can often be quite good sources for some of this stuff. It's like, what do you think I'd be good at, because they've got all this experience and so on. And so I think that's kind of quite a key thing to do. I remember once sitting in Downing Street and we were doing a skills policy announcement, and the Downing Street policy team are some of the brightest minds in the country. There's no doubt about it. They're incredibly clever, incredibly articulate. But I remember saying to people like, well, what are your skill sets? This is language that doesn't necessarily sort of cut through with people. And it was interesting because they couldn't really answer what their sort of skill sets were themselves. And so it's one of my kind of reflections, is that it's not always easy to know actually what you'll be good at. And one of the key things that I would say is just go out and try things, because it's equally valuable to learn what you're not good at as well. And I remember doing various internships and work experience and kind of getting to the end of a week and thinking, well, that's not a place I want to go and work. And actually that's equally valuable.
Definitely. And from my own life as well, I found out very quickly from a couple of jobs that I don't work well in sales or retail. It's not for me, but I'm still a people person. So doing those jobs really helps you figure out what you should not be doing and narrow down what you should be doing.
Totally.
So what's the most kind of surprising or thought-provoking insight that you've had, like a piece of something that's made you go, oh, that's really interesting, that you've kind of gained while you've been exploring this jobs of the future content for your podcast?
So I think one of the things is that all jobs change, right? And it doesn't matter who you speak to on the podcast. The job is not the same, whether it's a lawyer, whether it's an accountant, it's not the same as it was 10 or 15 years ago. But actually what changes is using tools and knowing how to use the different tools that are available. And that's something that I would say to people, is just make sure that you're experimenting with different things. And there are all these wonderful AI tools that are being released onto the market at the moment, from ChatGPT to Midjourney and so on. And if you can use those for school projects or extracurricular things, and then you can bring those into the business world, you're actually going to be more informed than a lot of people who are already working in the business world about those things. So go and play with them, and just have a bit of an experiment and see what you can kind of create, would be one of my big things. Is that it can sometimes, the world can feel a bit scary, and people talk about how AI is going to replace all the jobs and so on. I'm not in that space of that. I think we've always had jobs and we've always had technology. So that's what I would say with those, is go and experiment and learn, and you'll be far more proficient than a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you that some people are scary, but I'm sure back in the ye old day when we didn't know what a machine was that helps us ground wheat, we were scared of it, and now look at us, it's just another tool that we use. So yeah, get hold of that technology and learn to use it while you can. It's much easier to learn while you're young than when you're old, that's for sure.
That's true as well, definitely.
So obviously you have an OBE, as I mentioned at the start when I introduced you, Jimmy. Could you tell us, one, what you got the OBE for? And then how has that experience sort of influenced you with your work? And does it contribute to the discussions that you've had on your podcast? Has it changed the things that you think?
So I was given the OBE for public and political service. So it's for my 3 years in Downing Street, and having worked with Theresa May a little bit before that as well. And it was, I remember exactly when I was called, because I was called in the hospital just after our baby had been born, and it was the day after, and the signal wasn't great. And so they said, would you be willing to accept the honour? And I couldn't quite hear whether it was an MBE, an OBE, or a CBE. And I asked twice, and I still didn't quite catch it. And I thought to myself, well, at the end of the day, it doesn't particularly matter whether it's an MBE, OBE, or a CBE. I'm going to accept. So I think I should just wait until the official letter comes through, and I'll find out. So that always sticks quite clearly in the mind. And I think that it's one of the most exciting things that you can do with your career is public service, and whether that's working for the government, or whether it's working for the armed forces, whether it's being a teacher, there is a real benefit in going to do a job that benefits other people, and it's something that our royal family do a lot. And Prince Philip used to talk about, choose a life of public service and you will choose a life of adventure. And I think that's true. I would also say to people that public service is available at any time in their life and career, so you don't have to go for it from the outset. You can go and do better paid jobs, and work in the private sector more explicitly, and you can pursue that for the first part of your career, and then you can change into something that is more public service orientated as well. So it's always something that I try to encourage people to do and think about, that sort of second bit that I've just mentioned there about going and doing it. There are lots of different ways that people can get involved with it, particularly when they've achieved a bit in their career. And I would often try and point out the things that were available, because you've got these two big beasts. You've got the business world and the government world, and neither of them understand each other, and sometimes won't know the availability of jobs and different roles in them. And as somebody who's been in the middle of that, I try and inform both sides about what's available. That's one of the reasons we had Rishi Sunak come on the podcast, was to talk about jobs in the Treasury, right? Because there's 7,000 people that work at Treasury. And in my mind, the Treasury is probably one of the most interesting places that you can work, right? And the civil service fast stream is an amazing thing to check out, that people should do, that are ambitious, that want to do that. But I didn't know all the jobs that were available there. And I'd worked in politics for kind of 15 years. So it's like, if I don't sort of know that stuff, then, how are we expecting school children to do it? Another guest that we had on, Andrew Bailey, Governor of the Bank of England, again, a big job that we all see on the TV, and we all see how he's trying to get inflation down, etc. But actually, again, there's 5,000 people that work at the Bank of England. What are all the jobs there? And what's the job of the governor apart from getting inflation down? So that was another great episode as well that we talked to him lots about. And I'm just endlessly fascinated by these different jobs and the different options that are available for people, because there's a bit of a paradox at the heart of the world, I think, now, where there's never been more opportunity and availability of opportunity to people. But because there's so much of it and there's so much information out there, it can almost make it more overwhelming than it's ever been. And so that's what we try and do at Jimmy's Jobs of the Future, is try and break some of that stuff down a little bit.
I really, really love that. I don't think I could agree with you more that Google is such an amazing tool, and going onto a search engine and popping something in and it brings up loads of stuff, but sometimes it can be so difficult to filter out the stuff that you don't need. And that can be one of the hardest things, is finding the information. So it's really good to hear that, your aim is to look at those roles that people don't think about or don't know even exist, to try and uncover that.
Exactly, Charlie, but they don't help themselves as well. One of the most memorable moments of the podcast was interviewing the chief operating officer of BAE Systems, who basically create warplanes and warships, right? That is a very, very cool job. And we've got one of the people who'd been an apprentice that had risen through the ranks, and she'd had quite a tough kind of upbringing and stuff. Her name was Anastasia, and she was a brilliant speaker at this thing. And I said, well, we were in front of this room of sort of 500 employers, and I said, what can we do to make jobs more accessible, Anastasia, for somebody from your kind of background and understanding it that's a bit closer to these things? And she was like, oh, we just need to make job titles like simpler and more straightforward, etc., and explain to people like in real English what they are. And I was just like, but your job's like a quality assurance mechanical engineer thing. I can't remember the exact title, but I was just like, it was so unclear what it was. So even though we know these things, we're all still guilty of them. I mean, one of the things that I think is worth young people doing is getting on LinkedIn, and we've just started today hiring for somebody to kind of join us as a kind of almost junior graduate thing. Now, we've called the role kind of founders associate, which is quite a new title, but we've spent a lot of time on trying to make that job description as simple and straightforward that people can understand what the job will actually be.
Definitely. There's nothing worse than opening a description that you think might be suitable for you and then not understanding it and it not being able to go anywhere. So yeah, definitely can be like a difficult thing for the employers to make sure they're hitting the right person that they want. I'm going to ask you a final question for our kind of formal Q&A. We're going to move on to our student Q&As after this. And we've had some questions come in, so definitely excited to get onto those. But our final one, can you give us a piece of advice that you would give to an individual who might be a little bit uncertain, a little bit anxious? Obviously, anxiousness around careers and what we're going to do when you leave college or school can be quite a big thing. Considering that things are changing so rapidly with technology and all the different industries, what key piece of advice would you give someone who's a little bit worried?
I would say don't be afraid to try things. Most things that you do in your career will not work. And I think, particularly in the social media age where so much is kind of captured, I think there is a real risk-averse nature that's kind of being developed. And I was thinking earlier about giving some examples. I started a school sports newspaper when I was there. I mean, we only did 2 editions of it. I learned like quite a lot from that and doing it. And I think that's one of the things that I would say is just don't be afraid of making mistakes. Most people make mistakes most of the time. And you should just try things because you will learn from them.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to dive straight in and get as many of our student questions answered as we can. And we've got a real great mix, some kind of podcasting questions to political questions as well. So let's crack on with them. And we'll start with this first one, which comes from Derby College. And this is for their
is that from Derby College?
Yeah, Derby College. Yeah,
that's where I'm from, by the way. If people don't, I'm from Derbyshire, so that's good to see my home city being represented.
Good start then. I'm glad I picked that one. And this is from their students that are watching and studying media. How do you go about setting up a successful YouTube channel / podcast? And how did you get into that industry? Why did you decide to do that podcast?
Well, it's 2 almost different questions on the podcast and the YouTube side. And I feel like I should get my digital producer who's sitting behind the camera filming this in our studio to come and do the YouTube bit, really. But the reason I started the podcast was because it was simple and it was pretty low risk and low cost, right? So it was just like, sort of a couple of £50 mics that we were able to get and set up, and you just kind of hit record and you kind of get rolling, really. So that was why I did that initially, and I think one of the things to think about for people that for the more podcast, and I'll come on to the second bit about YouTube, but the bit I would say about podcasting is I would encourage most people. I don't, there's this whole thing at the moment that we've got too many podcasts. Well, I don't think we've got enough podcasts in the world, actually, and we should have more. Nobody ever says, oh, no, not another TV show being produced, right? Yeah, they do seem to sort of say that about podcasts. And I think it's a great thing for people, young people, to do. I would say just try and think a little bit about the kind of the content and try and just give it a bit of structure. You're not going to be Stephen Bartlett on day one. So just try and think about the specifics of it. So maybe it's interviewing local people in the local area, or maybe it's going and speaking to local businesses and such like. So that's what I would say on the sort of podcast side. And then on the YouTube side, we evolved to YouTube because the best place to grow a podcast is via social media, and most of social media is visual. And it's also, to get slightly technical for a moment, YouTube has a very powerful recommendation engine, like at the end of it, and they've got the sidebar on the right hand side which shows you all the other things. With podcasting, you don't have that. So it was kind of, we had to kind of expand into video to record on YouTube and also to sort of cut it up for our socials. But I think that's one of the biggest skills of the future, is understanding video editing and being able to kind of do it, and that being sort of like a pretty fundamental thing in lots of people's jobs. So that's what I would say. And in terms of growing it, there's a lot of advice out there on how to grow it, but it just takes a while to find your audience. And don't despair. I think there's a lot of good in social media, but one of the bad things I think it's done is it's slightly warped our numbers, and you sort of feel like, if you haven't got at least 50,000 listeners, then you're not a success. And actually just try and think about those numbers in real terms. Even if your podcast has only 20 or 30 listeners, that's actually a room above a pub.
Hello, I think we had a little blip with our internet there. I think it briefly just disappeared at the end of your sentence after you said pub.
I said pub. I would just say, like, even if it's just 20 or 30 people, actually that's a decent sized audience. That fills a room above a pub. That's not a bad place to be starting out. So don't get kind of, don't get too sort of downbeat about numbers and it not growing spectacularly. You'll be learning a lot more than you realise.
Definitely. Thank you for answering that one. That's a great one. First question in, so love it. Next, we're going to a question that has come in anonymously. And this is, would you recommend a career in politics? And how did you get started in your political career?
Would I recommend a career in politics? Yes, I would. I think it's a great place to explore jobs, and I think politics is so much of what we see of public service. We see it on the news, we see our politicians being involved, and I think getting involved with local parties is whether it's Labour or Conservative or Liberal Democrat, whatever, is a very useful way of kind of getting involved in a lot of it. I did a lot of my kind of first politics at university when I was at the University of Birmingham, and I met some amazing kind of people coming through who were shadow cabinet ministers at the time, and built some kind of amazing connections. Politicians are desperate to engage with young people, right? Like it sort of gives them a sort of sense of vigor and so on. So if you're young and you're engaging with politics, invite your local MP, you'll learn a lot. We were lucky at Birmingham because we had a lot of politicians coming to Birmingham because it was the UK's second city and so on. But yeah, that's where I first met Theresa May, was in the pub garden of the Gun Barrels pub, sort of just talking about it. And I remember back then she was sort of pushing all the kind of women to think about applying for politics and applying to become members of parliament. So I would persuade people to look at what's available and dip your toes in it, because actually you can try it out a bit and then think, well, maybe this isn't for me. But actually that experience will stand you in good stead.
Great. Awesome. I'll move straight on to the next one to get many as we can. You kind of touched on this, but it has come in personally from someone, so I'm going to ask it in case you have anything else to add. So it's from Amin, and they've said, "Hi, I've seen your podcast work and it's great. Do you have any advice for me as a year 13 student looking to start a podcast mostly around athletes and influential people?"
So I think that's a very good idea. I think so I try and find a niche. So what was it? It was athletes and
influential people. So I'm thinking very kind of sport around that sort of.
Yeah. So I would say start out and start on athletes if that's kind of your passion, and maybe even pick a sort of specific part of athletics, and maybe it's the training, and maybe it's writing to people, asking them what their first kind of training sessions were, and getting them to engage on that, trying to pick something that's easy for people to do and to talk about, is quite a good way of doing it. I mean, it was quite interesting, actually. I'll just help a small podcast out. The Rest is Politics podcast with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart. Their interview series, which is called Leading, had Seb Coe on it a couple of weeks ago. Now, Seb Coe was basically the world's fastest 800-meter runner, and back in the 80s, and he went on to actually become a Conservative member of Parliament and then ran the Olympics for London. So it's had this fascinating career. I could listen to Seb for hours, but one of the bits I found most interesting in it was where he was actually talking about his training regime before the Olympics and what it was back then and so on. So I would inspire you to kind of go and listen to that, definitely, and get some ideas from it. But I would say, try and pick a bit of a niche and find what you're interested in as well, right? I mean, that comes down to a lot of it, right? That's how you convey true passion, is by exploring what you're interested in. So whichever bit of the athletics it is, perhaps it's something around preparing for peak performance. I think that's something that's really interesting with athletics, is that most of the time they're actually only sort of performing at around 70 to 80%, and then they're getting ready to hit the 100%. That's interesting, because actually a lot of that ends up being about not training then in the week before, and that just must be incredibly hard, I think. So yeah, there we are. See, sounds like you'll have a listener in me anyway.
Thank you for sharing that piece of advice. Hopefully Amin is really helpful, and they are really happy with that. We've had an anonymous question, and I really like this one. What's the highlight of your career so far?
Gosh, that is a good question. There were so many moments at number 10. There was it's a good question. I'm going to give two answers to it. The one highlight was being on the Prime Minister's trip to China. It was fascinating. When you're at number 10, it's so full on that you don't spend a lot of time kind of reflecting, banking those kind of moments and so on. We were in a motorcade in China, in Beijing, and we got out at Tiananmen Square. And I did just have a moment that 10 years before, I had traveled from London to Beijing by train. So I'd gone all the way across Europe, Russia, etc., with three mates. And I sort of stood in that square, even bigger beard and longer hair than I've got now. And I just had a sort of moment of gosh, quite strange to be back here 10 years on, sort of in the Prime Minister's motorcade. I would also encourage people to travel when they're young as well. I do think it's an amazing thing and opportunity to do. And then the other career highlight I would say, was actually sitting down with Miles Jacobson for our 100th episode, the chief executive and football manager. I think it encompassed so much of what we wanted to do, jobs of the future, but it was also just a kind of recognition of how far we'd come in 100 episodes and so on. So they're the sort of two career highlights, I would say.
Great, I like it. One from the podcast, one from your political career. That's a good two, yes. I would say. Our next question comes in live from Wirral Community School, and they asked, what motivates you?
What motivates me? What motivates me is trying to share my knowledge, right? Like, and doing things like this and doing the podcast and just trying to make information interesting and accessible. Most of what the information I got when I was 16, 17, 18 about business, economics and politics was all from The Economist. And The Economist is great, but it's pretty impenetrable for a lot of people. And so that's what we try and do with the podcast, is get people that are doing interesting things, creating interesting jobs, whether it's like the manager of the Sidemen, Jordan Schwartzberger, and talking about all the stuff that happens behind that. All those amazing drone celebrations that we saw on New Year's Eve in London, right? Like, we got the guy on that kind of flies those drones, and the company that does that, based in Leeds, 50 people, what a job of the future, drone pilot, talking about that and all the planning and so on. So that's what kind of motivates me, is being able to take the knowledge that I've learned and kind of put it in an accessible format that people can benefit from.
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the things that I love about my job, is interviewing people and getting them to pass their knowledge on. So same sort of thing, but par removed. Okay, great. So next question then, and we've had loads, so we're not going to get a chance to answer them all because we're slowly coming towards the end of the time. We've about 2 or 3 more maybe, and we've got a question that's come from Daniel, again from Derby College. Sorry, where would be a good starting point to get your work out into the media? So say they want to start doing something, what's the first thing that they should do to get their work out there?
So I think this is a really, really good question, because in a way it's easier than it's ever been before, like I was saying earlier, because you can get people's contacts, you can get people's Twitter DMs and so on. But because of that, you end up having to do it a lot more because it's so easy. So I would say write to people, write about people, write a podcast review of your favorite podcast and what they've done well over the last 5 episodes and what they'd love to do more. Everyone loves kind of like flattery on that side of things. People now create so much content, it's quite easy to find something that they've done, someone that you admire, to go and get that sort of content. The other thing I would say is be imaginative. Like, one of the best things that I saw, again, I've mentioned this a bit, but I think LinkedIn is a great tool for business and careers. And I think that you might really like Ben Francis from Gymshark and really like what he does, but Ben is really, really busy, like, to put it mildly. But actually, there's this whole thing down the right-hand side of Ben's profile of people might also viewed these people. And it's basically all of his C-suite team at Gymshark, right? And follow the people that are interesting there. And to bring that back to a very specific story, there's a guy I know that really wanted to get a podcast interview with Noel Mack, who's the chief brand officer at Gymshark. And basically, he noticed that Noel was running a lot more, and he basically offered to do a podcast run with him and raise a bit of money for charity and do it just around the Gymshark store in London. And it was just a very clever way, and Noel's now agreed to do that. Now, that's quite a lot of effort to kind of do that, but being creative with these people, I think, is really important. So, just get in the habit of writing and recording and then sending it to people. Like, I think you have to be quite active in that. Like, people aren't going to sit there and discover you. So it's a good question. It's, just send it to people, whether it's Twitter, whether it's tagging people, etc. And you just have got to put a lot into it. And also, it's stuff stuff will be a bit rubbish at the beginning. Like, that's just inevitable whilst you sort of get going. So don't be disheartened with it, and keep going as well.
Great. So I had another one coming from Royal Community School, and they've asked, how do you think your area of work will be affected by AI?
Well, that's very good question, because it's being affected a lot. And yeah, when we first started the podcast 3.5 years ago, there were a team of 2 of us working on it full time, pretty much producing an episode a week. Now we can create a lot more content, and we can chop up a lot more. So it's becoming, and it's the tools that are being created to kind of do that. The tools that we use now a lot, whether it's Riverside for recording, whether it's Descript for editing, are becoming much more efficient at doing these things. So I think it's going to get easier to kind of produce content, and it's going to get to label the content and so on. So I think that's some of the biggest ways that it's going to change. But it definitely is doing. It's not replacing jobs at the moment, but it is, the opportunity of it is productivity gains, hugely.
Okay, great. We have time just about one last question before we look to close down the session. So we've had a question from Bluecoat Sixth Form, and they've asked a bit of a parter. So it's got a couple of parts to it. So what's the best way to manage time between your work life and your personal life, and how do you manage that? So how do you manage your work-life balance, and where should you, a little different, where should you get work experience from? So that's tagged on at the end. So basically 2 questions. Best way to manage your time, how do you get that work-life balance, and then where do you get work experience, where can you find it?
Find when you're most productive and do your work then. For me, I'm more of a mornings person, and I'm best after some physical activity. So I bike my kids to nursery each morning, then go for a run, and then I block out pretty much till midday just to work at my own. And then in the afternoon, I do things like this and chat to people, etc., when I know my energy levels will drop, but I know that talking to people will perk them up. So it's kind of working out all that stuff. I would say as well, try and box off when you're working and when you're not. It's quite easy for me because I just drop the kids to and from nursery, so I work in between that, and I don't really work in the evenings outside of that, or unless it's sort of something special or important. But it's easy, but it will all change as well. So just be comfortable with that as well. But just try and box off those sort of times for when you're doing those things. Best place to work experience is very hard to answer. So I did a lot of journalism work experience. I really wanted to be I really wanted to work in football journalism, basically, was where I sort of started out. And so I went and did loads of stuff with the local papers and radio things. And I would just, yeah, I would just do that. And I would also, I think now, write a blog, write things, and you can create your own work experience, and you can kind of create your own portfolios of these things, I would say. But that's the biggest thing that I just wanted to get across, is just don't be afraid of trying things, and just continue to do that. You will learn all the time. You will realize more about what you're doing. And look, we talk about this lots. Follow Jimmy's Jobs on TikTok, Instagram, etc. We're trying to go where young people are for a lot of this stuff, and I would love to hear from you guys about, like, what you think of the future of work and so on. And LinkedIn as well, I think, is quite a good sort of tool that you can. It's quite teasing. This is quite a good finish, right? Like, LinkedIn can be your kind of like professional place, right? And particularly now, social media is a big part of people's jobs and so on, and you'll want to be doing stuff on different platforms. But LinkedIn can be your separation of that sort of professional and personal. LinkedIn can be your kind of like social platform, and there's lots of people creating good content on there that you can follow. Followers, and the Sunny, the guys that work at Jimmy's Jobs as well. And let's stay in touch, because be optimistic about the future. There's never been more opportunity out there, but it has also been, it is also difficult to navigate. And that's what we're here to try and do, as is Speakers for Schools, right? And this is an amazing resource. Like, to have the different speakers that you do is incredible. And it was a real honor to be invited and asked to do it. And I spent watching people that had gone before me as well. And it was really, really interesting. So it is an amazing resource.
We're so happy that you were able to join us, and I think it's been a really interesting look at your own career and people that you've talked to. I've loved all your anecdotes. I love hearing stories. So it's been a great 45 minutes for me, hopefully for the young people watching as well. Jimmy,
Definitely.
before we go today, anything you'd like to say as we say goodbye?
No, just up the Rams to all the questions from Derbyshire. I'm fascinated to hear all those. And yeah, I would just, yeah, like keep, you know, I do think it is hard being it's hard being a young person now. Like it is tough, and there's quite a lot of pressure. And there's another thing that I think is different from my days, which is when I was at school, there weren't 29-year-olds going around that had been mega successful like Stephen Bartlett and Ben Francis. And in a way, it's amazing to have those people now as idols that are much closer to your age, but it can also sort of make you think, oh gosh, I'm not achieving, and so on. And it's like people develop in different stages, and don't sort of stress and worry about it. Just keep trying things, keep experimenting, and eventually you'll find your tribe and you will find what you're good at and you're passionate about.
They definitely will. They'll find it. Maybe not instantly, but they'll get it. It will click. Thank you for joining us today, Jimmy. It's been wonderful having you on, and a really great session.